G'day, and thank you for joining me today for an episode of Imperial Australian Gothic. Australian culture has long had a knack for staring into the bush and seeing, with remarkable consistency, itself. Not the country that was already there, not the people who had lived with it, named it, sung it, burned it, crossed it, and belonged to it for tens of thousands of years. No, the cultural imagination of settler Australia has often preferred a more flattering terror. The white figure lost, swallowed, or spiritually mauled by a landscape supposedly too ancient, too silent, too alien, and too rude to provide European certainty on request. This is the work of the Imperial Gothic. It turns colonization into atmosphere. It makes invasion feel like metaphysics. It converts land into menace, Indigenous presence into absence, and settler anxiety into national profundity. Each episode of Essays from a Strange Country looks at who Australians are through the lens of what our culture has produced, such as an Australian film, literature, art, and music, to ask how this country has imagined itself. This is not a search for one neat national identity. Mercifully, no such thing exists. Instead, we'll read through the mess, the stories, images, songs, and screen myths that make Australia feel familiar, strange, beautiful, brutal, and faintly ridiculous. And I'm your host, Jasmine Wolfe. Imperial Gothic is what happens when empire looks at the place it has invaded and decides the real victim is, naturally, itself. In the Australian context, the mode turns the continent into an alien, hostile, unreadable space, too vast, too old, too silent, too resistant to European sense-making. The land is not treated as inhabited country, already thick with law, story, custodianship, and memory. It becomes instead a brooding stage set for settler dread. This is the central trick of Imperial Gothic. It converts colonial possession into psychological ordeal. Rather than presenting settlement as a material process of seizure, violence, mapping, fencing, policing, and erasure, it recasts the settler as someone threatened by the very land they are occupying. The bush becomes monstrous, the rock becomes uncanny, the silence becomes accusatory, though rarely in any politically useful way. The landscape is imagined as alien, not because it is empty of meaning, but because it refuses to mirror European expectations back at Europe. Apparently, this was taken personally. The white vanishing trope is one of the sharpest instruments in this cultural toolkit. Its basic structure is familiar. A white figure enters the Australian landscape and disappears, often without explanation. The disappearance is not merely a plot device, it is a symbolic transaction. White bodies are absorbed into the land, and this absorption is then treated as profound, tragic, and nationally meaningful. The settler subject becomes vulnerable, spectral, almost sacrificial. The land becomes hungry. Indigenous presence, meanwhile, is pushed to the edge of the frame or removed altogether. A neat bit of narrative landscaping. Picnic at Hanging Rock remains the obvious example, partly because it stages the mechanism with such eerie elegance. The missing schoolgirls do not simply vanish, they are mythologized. Their disappearance becomes a national puzzle, a colonial haunting, a sign that the Australian landscape contains mysteries beyond European comprehension. Hanging Rock is made to appear ancient, powerful, and unknowable, but not necessarily Aboriginal in any concrete or sovereign sense. Its deep time is aestheticized. Its Indigenous meanings are displaced by settler bewilderment. The result is a landscape that seems full of presence while being narratively emptied of the people to whom it belongs. This is why the trope works as a discursive tool of empire. It does not merely reflect settler anxiety, it organizes it into a story that makes colonial occupation feel metaphysical rather than political. The settler does not dispossess, the settler is unsettled. The invader does not erase, the invader is swallowed. The historical fact of Aboriginal dispossession is replaced by the fictional spectacle of white disappearance. In this maneuver, white vulnerability becomes the emotional centre of the national imagination. Indigenous loss is not denied exactly. That would be too crude. It is made narratively secondary, which is often more effective. The Gothic is especially useful here because it thrives on repression. Something terrible has happened, but the form allows the culture to misrecognize what that terrible thing is. The haunted house becomes the haunted continent. The buried crime becomes a vague atmospheric disturbance. The colonial past returns not as land theft, massacre, and legal fiction, but as mist, silence, madness, and missing girls in white dresses. One can admire the aesthetic efficiency while still noticing the moral shabbiness. Imperial Gothic therefore helps lay the cultural foundation for a distinctly Australian mode of settler storytelling: anxious possession. The land is claimed but never comfortably. It is occupied but imagined as unknowable. It is named, painted, mapped, and mythologized, yet repeatedly described as resistant to belonging. This contradiction is not a flaw in the tradition. It is the tradition. Settler culture wants the authority of possession and the glamour of victimhood. The white vanishing trope gives it both. The crucial point is that absence in these narratives is manufactured. The vanished white body becomes meaningful because Indigenous presence has already been pushed out of view. Aboriginal history is overwritten by settler mystery. Aboriginal sovereignty is replaced by European unease. The land appears empty enough to haunt, but not inhabited enough to answer back. That is the ideological elegance of the Imperial Gothic. It makes the colonizer feel metaphysically endangered in a place where colonial power was, in material terms, doing rather well for itself. So, before Australian literature, film, art, and music developed their many variations on bush melancholy, lost children, uncanny landscapes, and doomed white wanderers, Imperial Gothic supplies the grammar. It teaches the culture how to see the land as threatening, how to turn dispossession into atmosphere, and how to make white fear look like national depth. A bleak achievement, but an achievement all the same. Before the white vanishing trope became a literary and cinematic national hobby, it had to be made visible. Colonial painting did much of that early heavy lifting. Frederick McCubbin's The Lost Child and William Ford's At the Hanging Rock helped establish a visual language through which settler Australians could understand the bush as hostile, inscrutable, and vaguely offended by their presence. These works did not simply represent landscape, they trained viewers how to feel about it. The bush became not a lived Indigenous place thick with knowledge, law, memory, and use, but a Gothic theatre of disappearance. McCubbin's The Lost Child is central here because it turns the settler child into a symbolic national body. The child is small, vulnerable, and visually overwhelmed by the surrounding bush. The landscape does not merely frame her, it absorbs her. Trees crowd the composition. The ground offers no clear path. There is no comforting horizon, no tidy pastoral order, no sign that European presence has properly arranged the place into something useful. The painting invites viewers to experience the bush as a space of entrapment, not belonging. Its emotional power rests on the possibility that the child may vanish into a land that refuses to yield meaning. The lost child is not just a sentimental figure. though colonial culture was hardly above sentimentality when it suited the cause. The child condenses a much larger settler fear that the colony itself might not survive its own geography. In this sense, the lost child becomes a proxy for the uncertain future of white Australia. The child's vulnerability is national vulnerability. Her disorientation becomes the disorientation of settlers who imagined themselves as pioneers, but often behaved more like tenants who had misplaced the lease. The bush appears as a Gothic vacuum, a place emptied of recognizable cultural signs, then filled with dread. The problem, of course, is that this emptiness is manufactured. The land was not empty. It was not unknowable. It was not waiting around, brooding theatrically, for Europeans to stumble into spiritual crisis. Indigenous people knew these places intimately, and their presence gave the landscape precisely the historical and cultural density that settler art so often refused to see. But the colonial visual imagination preferred another story. By presenting the bush as alien and unreadable, it converted Indigenous presence into atmospheric absence. The land could then appear terrifying because it lacked European meaning, rather than because it had been violently seized from those who already belonged to it. William Ford's At the Hanging Rock develops this same visual grammar. Hanging Rock becomes less a geological formation than a Gothic apparatus, looming, strange, and faintly accusatory. Like McCubbin's bush, Ford's landscape is not passive scenery. It possesses agency. It seems capable of swallowing people, secrets, and perhaps the odd schoolgirl, given enough time and the right costume department. The rock's visual force comes from its ambiguity. It is solid yet unstable in meaning, monumental yet uncanny. Such images helped build the visual cliches later inherited by Australian Gothic: the vertical rock face, the dense scrub, the disoriented figure, the landscape that appears to watch back. These visual cliches were especially powerful for urban Australians, many of whom encountered the bush less as a daily environment than as a cultural idea. Painting gave them a usable bush, not necessarily accurate, but emotionally efficient. It taught the city viewer that the interior was a place of danger, loss, and metaphysical inconvenience. This mattered because national identity was being built through images as much as through policy, literature, or schoolbook nonsense about brave settlers. The bush became the proving ground of Australian identity, but also its haunting. To belong to the land, white Australians first had to imagine being threatened by it. This is where the lost child motif quietly performs its ideological work. It shifts attention from invasion to vulnerability. The settler does not appear as occupier, but as endangered innocent. The landscape is not stolen, it is menacing. The emotional centre is not Indigenous dispossession, but white precarity. That is the neat trick. The child's lostness becomes morally clarifying, because who wants to argue with a lost child? Yet the innocence of the child helps launder the violence of settlement. The viewer is invited to mourn the fragility of white presence rather than question the conditions that produced it. This visual inheritance has not disappeared. It persists in contemporary Australian nature writing, film, photography, and painting through what might be called an unsettled settledness. The peculiar condition of living in a place while still narrating it as if it resists habitation. Contemporary works may be more self-aware, more ecologically alert, and less obviously colonial in their assumptions, but the old Gothic residue remains. The landscape is still often figured as brooding, withholding, or spiritually overfull in ways that trouble white belonging. Even when modern artists critique settlement, they often work within a visual field shaped by these earlier images of disorientation and loss. The importance of McCubbin and Ford then is not that they invented Australian anxiety from scratch. Settler culture had plenty of that lying around. Their significance lies in giving that anxiety a durable visual form. They helped establish the bush as a space where white bodies could become lost, imperiled, and symbolically national, while Indigenous presence was pushed to the edge of visibility or removed altogether. The lost child became one of Australian culture's most persistent images because it solved a colonial problem rather elegantly. It made settlers look like victims of the land they had taken. Not bad work if one has no shame. By the time the white vanishing trope reaches Australian literature and film, it has stopped being merely a spooky colonial image and become something far more useful, a national myth. This is where Imperial Gothic does its neatest work. It turns settlement anxiety into cultural depth. It gives white Australia a wound to contemplate, preferably at sunset while leaving the foundational wound of colonisation politely off-screen. Very tidy, very Australian. Joan Lindsay's picnic at Hanging Rock is the obvious centrepiece here, not because it invents the trope, but because it perfects its cultural logic. The novel and Peter Weir's 1975 film adaptation, even more so, stage disappearance as sacred mystery. The missing schoolgirls do not simply get lost. They vanish into the landscape, leaving behind no body, no evidence, no explanation. This traceless disappearance is crucial. If there were a body, there would be a crime. If there were a crime, there would be history. Instead, there is atmosphere, heat, rock, corsets, insects, panpipes doing unspeakable things. The landscape becomes unknowable, seductive, hostile, and vaguely guilty, but never politically legible. That is the sleight of hand. The bush appears as the agent of violence while actual colonial violence disappears from view. The rock takes the girls, the land absorbs them. White bodies become victims of place, and the settler imagination gets to rehearse suffering without having to mention dispossession. This is not an accident of Gothic mood. It is the structure of the thing. Imperial Gothic casts the land as alien and excessive so that settler occupation can be narrated as ordeal rather than invasion. The colonial subject does not arrive as possessor but as endangered innocent, trembling before a continent that refuses to behave like Surrey with gum trees. In this sense, Picnic at Hanging Rock offers what critics have called a myth of origin for white Australia. Not the actual origin, obviously, because that would involve all the unpleasant administrative details of empire. Instead, the myth begins with white vulnerability. A group of schoolgirls, symbols of imported civility and reproductive futurity, enter the bush and are undone by it. Their disappearance becomes a founding trauma, a monument to settler fragility. The nation is imagined not through conquest but through loss. White Australia gets to mourn itself into belonging. This mourning performs a strange kind of claim-making. The vanished white body becomes a substitute ancestral marker, a way of writing European presence into the land. Critics describe this as a paradoxical, discursive indigenization. Settlers symbolically become native to the place through disappearance, burial, absorption, or haunting. The logic is grubby but effective. If the land contains white dead, then perhaps white people belong after all. If the landscape has swallowed them, perhaps it has accepted them. Never mind that Aboriginal people were already materially and spiritually bound to country. The Gothic does not deny Indigenous presence so much as muffle it beneath a more marketable mystery. Film intensifies this process because it can make absence look beautiful. Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock does not simply adapt Lindsay's novel, it visualizes national amnesia as art cinema. The camera lingers over the rock as if it holds an ancient secret, which of course it does, though not the one the film is keen to discuss. Its slow pans, blurred light, and suspended temporality transform colonial space into metaphysical puzzle. The result is not historical inquiry, but aestheticized bewilderment. The viewer is encouraged to ask what happened to the girls, rather than what histories are being displaced by this obsession with missing white children. One question sells tickets. The other rather spoils the picnic. The power of the trope lies in how innocent it seems. A disappearance is not on its face an argument about land ownership. A Gothic mystery is not apparently a legal doctrine. Yet the repeated cultural fascination with vanished white bodies does ideological work. It shifts attention from Indigenous dispossession to settler estrangement. It makes the landscape seem empty except for the emotional drama of Europeans encountering it. It casts Aboriginal presence as spectral, symbolic, or decorative, a resonant absence rather than a living sovereignty. In the process, literature and film do not merely reflect national anxiety, they organize it. This is why the white vanishing trope matters beyond Picnic at Hanging Rock. It becomes a template for Australian cultural production more broadly. The bush as menace, the settler as victim, the past as mystery, the Indigenous as background pressure. The Gothic supplies the mood, but the politics sit underneath, doing the heavy lifting. White disappearance becomes a way of narrating possession without admitting possession. It allows settler culture to feel haunted while remaining curiously vague about who is doing the haunting and why. So, literature and film consolidate what colonial art first sketched. They turn the lost child, the missing girl, and the swallowed settler into national symbols. Through them, white Australia imagines itself as fragile, mournful, and metaphysically displaced. That this displacement occurs on stolen land is the awkward bit. Imperial Gothic's genius, if that is the word for something so morally nimble, is to make that awkwardness feel like mystery. The strongest defense of the lost child and white vanishing tradition is that it is not simply a colonial magic trick, however convenient that would be for a clean argument. Critics such as Peter Pearce read the lost child narrative as part of a broader humanist pattern in Australian culture, a recurring attempt to understand fear, vulnerability, and dislocation in a place that settler society never quite knew how to inhabit. On this view, the vanishing child is not only a symbol of imperial entitlement, but also of genuine existential terror. The bush in these narratives does not merely hide Indigenous presence beneath a tasteful layer of settler panic. It also exposes the fragility of European confidence in a landscape that refuses to behave like England with better lighting. Pearce's argument takes the effective force of these stories seriously. The lost child is not an incidental figure in Australian literature and art. It is one of the culture's most stubborn images. Children wander off, search parties fail, the bush closes in, the family, that tiny colonial unit of order and inheritance, suddenly finds itself useless. This is not subtle symbolism, but Australian culture has never been shy about repeating itself when anxious. For Pearce, such stories reveal a society persistently fearful of its position in place and time. That fear is not merely decorative, it is foundational. Settler Australians inherited a landscape they claimed politically, but did not understand culturally, spiritually, or historically. The result was not confidence but unease, a sense of being lodged somewhere immense, ancient, and indifferent, without the familiar coordinates of European memory. This counter-reading reframes the Gothic not as crude propaganda but as an imaginative response to ontological displacement. The settlers arrive with European habits of meaning, ruins, churches, ancestral estates, graves, old roads, mythic forests, and all the other comforting clutter of a civilization that likes to pretend history is a family heirloom. Australia offered something else. To European eyes, the continent appeared to lack a past tense in forms they recognized. That failure of recognition was, of course, the settlers' problem, not the land's. Still, in the literature and art produced from within that settler consciousness, the effect was profound. Without visible signs of European ancestry, settlers experienced the place as strangely unmoored. The Gothic supplied a language for that disorientation, haunting, disappearance, silence, menace, repetition. Very tidy, really, if one ignores the catastrophes sitting just outside the frame. In this sense, Picnic at Hanging Rock can be read not only as an allegory of erasure, but also as an expression of metaphysical instability. The vanished schoolgirls do not simply become symbolic sacrifices to settler belonging, they also embody the collapse of European systems of order. Clocks stop, rational inquiry fails, class discipline dissolves, and the landscape refuses explanation. The girl's disappearance is terrifying because it cannot be turned into knowledge. No body, no confession, no properly filed answer. The narrative leaves settler modernity standing in the scrub with its hat in its hand, looking faintly ridiculous. This is why the trope remains powerful. It dramatizes a psychic condition rather than merely staging an ideological maneuver. The humanist argument also insists that fear of place is not automatically illegitimate because it belongs to settlers. White Australians did experience alienation, grief, and uncertainty. Their cultural productions register those feelings with real intensity. To dismiss every lost child narrative as nothing more than racial erasure risks flattening the emotional complexity of these works. It also gives colonial culture too much coherence, as though every anxious image were part of a perfectly efficient imperial machine. In truth, settler culture is often less a machine than a shed full of broken tools: guilt, longing, denial, dread, nostalgia, and the occasional bush ballad. The white vanishing trope emerges from that mess. It expresses a desire to belong, but also the suspicion that belonging cannot simply be declared by survey map, fence line, or school excursion. Yet this counter-argument, while important, has limits. The fact that the trope expresses genuine anxiety does not absolve it of its cultural work. Humanist fear can still be politically useful. A narrative may sincerely explore settler vulnerability while also displacing Indigenous sovereignty. Indeed, that is precisely what makes the trope so effective. Its emotional truth gives it cover. The lost white child appears universal, innocence threatened by wilderness, but the universality is rigged. The child's vulnerability becomes the nation's vulnerability. The settler's fear becomes the central drama. The landscape becomes terrifying because it will not yield its secrets to European interpretation. Meanwhile, Indigenous presence is pushed into atmosphere, mystery, or silence. Very moving, also very convenient. So the counter perspective should not be rejected outright. Pearce is right that the lost child tradition reveals something real about Australian settler consciousness. Its fear of being out of place, out of time, and out of historical depth. These texts are not empty colonial slogans. They are emotionally and symbolically rich attempts to process the settler condition. But they also show how easily settler anxiety becomes national mythology. The problem is not that white Australians imagined themselves as frightened. The problem is that this fear became culturally dominant, even sacred, while the far more material history of Indigenous dispossession was converted into background mood. The Gothic bush, then, is not simply a racist invention or a neutral humanist landscape. It is both wound and weapon, a place where settler culture mourns itself and somehow expects applause for the performance. The Imperial Gothic does not stay politely inside 19th century novels and colonial paintings, where one might prefer it to remain like a bad family heirloom in the shed. It hardens into a broader cultural habit. Across Australian literature, film, art, and music, the bush becomes less a place inhabited by Indigenous peoples and more a psychic weather system for white dread. The result is what critics have described as Australia's culture of mourning, a national imaginary in which grief is everywhere, but its ownership is rather selective. The landscape mourns, the settlers mourn, the missing girls, dead lovers, vanished children, traumatized hunters, and spiritually inconvenienced white protagonists all mourn. Indigenous presence, meanwhile, is often reduced to atmosphere. This is where the white vanishing trope becomes more than a plot device. It becomes a cultural structure. Earlier colonial art established the lost child as an emblem of settler vulnerability. Literature and film then expanded that figure into a national myth of disappearance. By the time the trope circulates through late 20th and 21st century popular culture, the vanishing white body no longer needs much explanation. It has become part of the furniture. A white figure enters the bush turns strange, and culture politely gathers around the resulting wound. The old colonial fantasy of hostile land has been modernized into melancholy. It wears better lighting now. Nick Cave and Kylie Minogue's Where the Wild Roses Grow is a useful example because it compresses Australian Gothic into the shape of a murder ballad. The song is not explicitly about the Australian bush in the narrow geographical sense, yet it draws on the same Gothic grammar: flowers, water, death, beauty, innocence, and the erotic charge of disappearance. Eliza Day is aestheticized through her death. She becomes an image before she becomes a subject. Her body is placed among wild roses, absorbed into a landscape of lyrical prettiness, and the violence done to her is converted into mood. The song's duet structure gives her a voice, but only from within the frame of her own murder. She narrates, yes, but as a beautiful corpse. Australian Gothic has always had a gift for letting the dead speak just long enough to make the living feel profound. The relevance of Where the Wild Roses Grow lies in this transformation of violence into atmosphere. Like Picnic at Hanging Rock, it turns disappearance into artful uncertainty. The crime is intimate rather than historical. The grief is stylized rather than political. The audience is invited to contemplate loss, beauty, and fatal desire, not the structures that make some bodies endlessly mournable and others culturally disposable. This is not to accuse the song of secretly being a land rights policy document gone wrong. That would be silly, and not even in an interesting way. Rather, it shows how Gothic feeling can detach grief from history. Suffering becomes exquisite, death becomes decorative. Mourning becomes a national aesthetic. A similar pattern operates in The Hunter, where the Tasmanian wilderness is staged as a site of ecological grief and masculine estrangement. The film follows Martin David, a mercenary sent to find the supposedly extinct Tasmanian tiger. Its Gothic force depends on absence, the absent animal, the absent father, the absent future, the absent moral certainty of modern life. Tasmania appears as a haunted environment, damaged by industry and shadowed by extinction. The film is alert to environmental destruction, and its melancholy is not trivial. Yet the emotional centre remains the white outsider's encounter with loss. He arrives as an agent of extraction and ends as a figure of wounded, ecological conscience. The thylacine itself carries a heavy historical charge. Although recent scholarship suggests that hunting and settler expansion were not the only causes of the thylacine's extinction, they were hardly irrelevant. The species may have been declining for centuries before British colonisation, but colonial occupation accelerated that decline through habitat disruption, pastoral expansion, bounty schemes, and sustained persecution. In that sense, the thylacine's extinction cannot be separated from the wider violence of settler colonialism in Tasmania, where both native animals and Aboriginal peoples were increasingly treated as inconvenient obstacles to land possession. The blame is often placed on colonisation not because it invented every pressure on the species, but because it turned those pressures into policy, profit, and routine destruction. Very civilized, naturally. And The Hunter largely converts this history into existential sadness. The landscape is full of implication, but implication is doing a lot of unpaid labour. Indigenous history hovers as a resonant absence, felt, suggested, available as depth, but not fully centred. The film mourns extinction while keeping the settler subject at the front of the emotional queue. The white protagonist learns to grieve properly, and the landscape functions as his difficult tutor. Australia does enjoy educating its settlers through other people's catastrophe. This is the cultural consolidation of the Imperial Gothic. White Australians become the privileged mourners of a history from which they have also benefited. The bush is imagined as wounded, but its wound is translated into white alienation. The settler is frightened by the land, then saddened by it, then spiritually deepened by that sadness. The process is almost elegant if one ignores the moral plumbing. What began as a colonial discourse of hostile territory becomes a modern discourse of environmental victimhood. The white subject no longer simply fears being swallowed by the land. He now mourns the land's damage, often without fully confronting the colonial relations that produced that damage in the first place. This is why the counter-argument about humanist anxiety only gets us so far. Yes, lost child narratives and Gothic disappearances can express genuine fear, grief, and metaphysical uncertainty. Settlers did experience the bush as strange and dangerous. People did get lost. Children did die. The point is not that white grief is fake. The point is that Australian culture has repeatedly organised itself around that grief while treating Indigenous loss as background pressure. White mourning becomes universal. Indigenous mourning becomes local, political, or supplementary. One is art, the other is content. Recent Aboriginal horror, including John Bell's The Mugai, exposes the limits of this arrangement by shifting the source of terror away from vague bush menace and toward colonial violence itself. In that framework, horror does not come from the land being unknowable to settlers. It comes from histories of child removal, medical control, surveillance, and the ongoing invasion of Aboriginal family life. The Gothic is not abandoned, it is repossessed. The monster is no longer just the landscape or the mystery or the ancient rock doing its usual cryptic routine. The monster is colonial power, dressed in respectable clothes and carrying paperwork. It reveals how narrow the older national mourning has been. Imperial Gothic taught Australian culture to grieve for the settlers' insecurity while leaving Indigenous sovereignty and survival half visible, like something glimpsed at the edge of the frame. Music and film inherit this habit when they turn the bush into a theatre of white melancholy. The result is a culture very good at mourning disappearance, provided the disappeared body is the right one. White Australia becomes, in this tradition, the subject with the greatest cause to mourn. Not because history supports the claim, but because culture has staged the scene that way. And once the stage is built, everyone knows where to stand. That's all for this episode of Essays from a Strange Country. I'm Jasmine Wolfe, and you've been listening to a small attempt to make sense of Australian identity through the things we create when we're not busy avoiding the question entirely. Film, literature, art, and music give us more than cultural decoration. They give us evidence. If today's episode has left you with a firmer answer about what Australia is, I'm afraid something has gone wrong. The point is not to solve the country. The point is to notice how often it contradicts itself and how revealing those contradictions can be. Join me again next week for a deeper dive into the story of Picnic at Hanging Rock. Or the week after that when I begin an exploration into Aboriginal Gothic, just in time for 2026 NAIDOC Week. The acronym stands for the National Aboriginal and Islanders Day Observance Committee, and it is an annual Australian observance that celebrates the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, share it, or mention it vaguely to someone at a barbecue before the conversation collapses into real estate. Until next time, keep reading the margins, watching the background, and listening for what the culture tries not to say.